Okay, good morning. We're going to call to order Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan Subcommittee meeting, October 21st, 2020. And can we have a roll call?
Okay, here we go. Chair Sneeden.
Here.
Vice Chair Davis.
Here.
Member Jordan.
Here.
Member Sloan.
Here.
Member Kramer.
Here.
Member Longstreet.
Here.
Member Schwartz.
Here.
And Member Wiscombe.
Here.
Member Friedman will be in attendance at a later time. Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you. And Ms. Hedrick, do we have any announcements or anything on agenda review?
No.
Okay, so we will get started with the agenda items. Let's just talk a little bit about protocol and how we'll run this meeting. This is our first time, welcome back. This is our first time meeting as a subcommittee online. So we'll just talk a little bit about protocol. We'd like you, if you have your cameras, to have them on, committee members, so that the public can see us, and so that Ms. Hedrick has someone to talk to as she's presenting. And we'll go through a sort of high-level overview of where we are, and discussion then about where we're going. And we'll leave definitely time to talk about our future meetings, and try and set a timeline for our expectations for those meetings and what we're hoping to bring out of the committee and forward on to council, and the format that we're doing that in. I think in the interest of trying to get through this broader picture of where we are right now, let's do our best to let Ms. Hedrick get through slides and sections, and then she'll take breaks and ask if there are questions. And because there are many of us, if you're ready to speak, you can just jump in, but we'll try to do rounds of questions to make sure that we're getting to everyone, particularly because not everyone has a camera on right now. So with that, I think if there are any questions about how we'll run things, and if we could just now comment on, we'll save public comment toward the end, and we'll leave time for public comment, but then also time for us to do a final round of comments so that we can address any public comment that has come up. Any concerns or questions about how we'll proceed? No? Okay. So thank you, Ms. Hedrick, if you'd like to take over.
Thanks, Chair Sneeden. For those of you who don't know, I'm Melissa Hedrick, project planner with the city's planning division. So next slide. So this is our agenda today. As Councilmember Sneeden mentioned, we do public comment at the end of our subcommittee meetings. And we'll start with just an update on what we've been up to with the Sea Level Rise program in the last several months.
Excuse me, Ms. Hedrick, just very briefly, Councilmember Friedman is on the meeting. He's having some technical difficulties, so I just want to make sure we note that he's here, and if he needs any help, he'll work on that. But I just wanted to note that before you got started. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, then I'll then go through the comments that we received on the public draft adaptation plan and our anticipated response to those comments. And then we'll discuss any comments that the subcommittee has on the document. And in the slides, I divide the comments up into three categories. Comments that are items that where the commenter is advocating for something but don't necessarily require edits to the document. So we'll start with those. And then the second category are comments that we're anticipating ESA needing to do some edits to the technical edits to the document. So we'll go through those. And then I've put another set of comments are things that I felt that the subcommittee or other subcommittee members emailed me about that where the subcommittee wanted to have discussion. And so we'll quickly go through those as a list and see if there's any additional ones, and then kind of go back to them and discuss them one by one. And we might not get through discussing each specific comment in that category through this meeting, but we'll finish whatever we need at the next meeting. So that's the plan, and then we'll end with talking about our upcoming meetings. So next slide. So what have we been up to since January? So I think, as most of you know, we had a almost 2-month public outreach period. We went to, what was it, 8 commission and council meetings as listed on the slide. And thank you for welcoming me to each of your commission meetings. The meetings were very interesting and provided a lot of interesting dialogue. I would just say in some cases, the meetings, there wasn't a lot of comments during the meeting, but I did get a lot of follow-up in emails and phone calls, people asking questions, wanting to hear more about our plan and how we're doing things. It is obvious that we are one of the first adaptation plans out of the gate, particularly the first that kind of has an implementation focus and a focus on near-term actions. And so I've been getting a lot of comments, or not comments, but questions from other agencies of people wanting to basically replicate our process. So that's exciting. So we've compiled all the comments. ESA has already started some edits that were identified, and we're compiling the subcommittee's comments today. ESA will then finish editing the document in the next couple weeks. And then the subcommittee will consider a recommendation to council, and then we'll go to council either at the end of the year or the beginning of next year. Next slide. So again, I think we'll see what comes out of the discussion, but we're anticipating about 2 to 3 subcommittee meetings in October and November. There's this one where we're going to hear the comments on the plan. And then we'll work through the discussion items that come out of those comments through this meeting and possibly the next. Any significant additional information that ESA is adding to the document, like the socioeconomic information, I will have a presentation on that either next meeting or the meeting after. And then the final meeting, we will be considering our the subcommittee's recommendation to council. Does anybody have any questions about the subcommittee process? Okay, next slide. So in general, what are the actions that staff will be recommending to council? This is a draft of the recommendations that we're considering will be recommended by staff to council, and that includes adoption of the adaptation plan, directing staff to begin implementation of the plan, including development of a 5-year implementation plan. And then we would like to initiate an LCP amendment, a really focused one, to update the coastal land use plan, to update the shoreline hazard screening map with our new hazards information that's in our maps in the adaptation plan, and to do take another look at our hazard policies to make sure there aren't any edits we need to implement the plan. But I'm not anticipating that LCP amendment being a complete overhaul. We've talked to Coastal Commission, and they are not they don't need us to adopt the adaptation plan as part of the LCP. They're fine with us keeping it separate and really just keeping the LCP as development review policies or needed aspects of the adaptation plan, not the whole plan itself being incorporated into the LCP. Are there any questions or comments on where we're headed with this? No? Okay, next slide. So since January, we have been up to a lot. The Santa Barbara, I just wanted to kind of mention some of these things so you are aware of them. The Santa Barbara County Climate Collaborative started a sea level rise subcommittee. So we've been meeting on that with other agencies from the county and Beacon, and trying to figure out kind of the topics that we're going to work through on that. A lot of them are, for instance, like case law and other information sources. We've also been collaborating with Beacon and predominantly applying for different grants to coordinate with Beacon on a shoreline monitoring program. And we haven't heard back positively yet on any of those grants, but we are going to continue seeking grant funds with them to try to develop a pilot regional shoreline monitoring program in the city that could be scaled up to the region, with Beacon helping to implement that over time. We also are, in November, there is a King Tide event, and the waterfront and parks are going to be taking photos and drone footage during that time to document the King Tides. And then I think most of you know that as part of the last budget cycle, the council created a new sustainability and resilience department. And for now, with our limited budget that includes the energy team, the climate energy team, and then the environmental services division. So their focus right now is on implementation of the strategic energy plan, environmental services, and then they're launching a comprehensive update of the climate action plan. And that really will be mostly focused on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Although we will tie into on the website and others with resiliency efforts. So I think in the long term, it is anticipated that resilience planning, such as sea level rise, will end up in that department, but it's just being formed and kind of staffed up as budget allows. Next slide. So were there any questions or comments on that? Okay. So just going through the comments that we received 17 written comments, 3 from agencies, Beacon, the Coastal Commission, and Caltrans, community groups such as Community Environmental Council, Heal the Ocean, and the SB Board of Realtors, and then a number of individuals, including several technical people that work throughout the state on sea level rise, such as Gary Griggs and Dave Revell and others. And then we received a number of verbal comments at all the commission meetings and public webinars. And so we've documented those. Next slide. So this is what I was talking about. I have categorized the comments into 3 general categories. And I, prior to the meeting, I had sent you all the comments and also a summary of the comments that's also available on the subcommittee's web page under working documents, and also available on our main web page, the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan web page. So hopefully you have had a chance to read through them. So again, I've put them into 3 major categories: comments advocating certain priorities, consideration, or actions moving forward; comments asking for technical edits to the document; and then comments asking for changes to priorities, near-term actions, and process for implementation. And that 3rd category is really where I want, I see the subcommittee having substantial discussion. So next slide. So just to let you know kind of the range of comments we heard, these are major topics. You'd have to really read through the comments themselves to get an idea of what all people are advocating for. But in general, there was large support for the city planning for sea level rise, getting out ahead of this issue, and taking a proactive approach and getting things rolling. There were comments advocating for us to consider private property rights and assist private property owners, and to make sure that our program equally considers private property and public property. There were comments advocating for nature-based solutions such as dunes, offshore reefs. If we do have to put in things like levees, making sure we keep creek riparian areas and make it as green as possible. Comments advocating for the retention of beaches and retreat and inland movement of beaches. There were a lot of comments about making sure moving forward that we continue to be very transparent. So being very clear about what we mean by our policies, being very clear about what kind of data that we are getting and making sure that that's available to the public, and keeping the public very engagement very transparent. Next slide. There's a lot of support for taking actions based on amounts of sea level rise, not projections. The flip side of that comment is people concerned that the projections are not conservative enough, and wanting to see more proactive planning assume that sea level rise could be even faster. So we kind of saw both sides. Almost everybody commented on that either way, that the projections were too conservative or that they weren't conservative enough. But there was, in general, a lot of support for taking our actions based on triggers with sea level rise. A lot of support for regional collaboration. A lot of comments emphasizing the importance of shoreline monitoring. Several comments that want to emphasize that reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are a way of helping with sea level rise or being more resilient to sea level rise, and wanting to emphasize that more in the plan. And then we heard just a lot of concerns about budget impacts, how this is all going to get paid for, where's the money going to come from, are there going to be impacts to user fees and slip fees and that kind of thing, what kind of funds are available at the federal and state level, a lot of questions. And then there were a few comments that expressed concern about over-reliance on beach nourishment, and the focus of those comments were really that it's hard to find sand, that everybody's going to be competing for sand, and that if the sand quality is too fine, that it basically just comes off the beaches, and during a big El Nino storms, that the storms could essentially remove the sand very quickly. And so the comments seem to focus on, hey, don't put all your eggs in that basket. Make sure that we're planning for other actions too, just in case. So next slide. Another very common comment across the board was the importance of incorporating sea level rise into our emergency planning and hazard mitigation plans, that we adapt as much as we can, but just in case, we have a backup contingency of emergency planning and collaboration. That we incorporate more moving forward the airport's plans for sea level rise into our implementation. That we consider real estate disclosures moving forward, that we analyze habitat impacts of projects, and then the economic costs and benefits of projects. And then a lot of comments advocating for advanced planning for Stearns Wharf, the harbor, and the wastewater system. Next slide. So these are the comments that we have forwarded already to ESA to begin working on in the document. And those include bringing forward more historic flooding and erosion information from the 2012 Griggs and Russell study. So if you've seen that study, it really has an amazing amount of information and photos from historic El Nino events, and looking at areas that have flooded in the city and had erosion events previously in the city, and that is a good guide for what will happen in the future, just more frequently. And while that information, some of that information was in the vulnerability assessment, it really didn't get pulled into the adaptation plan very well, but it is very important, I think, for the public visually to see that those pictures and analysis. So ESA is working on essentially including aspects of the 2012 Griggs-Russell historic information in the actual document. And then we're going to be trying to add some of those photos to the web page. There were also several comments wanting to understand more how sea levels have already risen and what is the baseline for our projections. So they'll be adding information about that. What they'll also be highlighting in the executive summary more that the biggest threats during El Nino, the biggest threats now are during El Nino storms and the big erosion and flooding events that can happen during those storms. And many of these comments were actually from Gary Griggs, who we ended up meeting with and really talking through the whole document with, which was great. And then we received comments from the Coastal Commission and several other entities wanting to include some basic socioeconomic impact analysis. And staff agree that this would be a really good metric to look at. In addition, for applying for grants for projects, such as the Shoreline Monitoring Program, it's almost always required to identify if any disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged communities are affected. So it's good to have that information in. That said, we are out of budget predominantly on the adaptation plan. Really what we have left in our budget is to do pretty minor edits to the plan and not take on a whole new expansive analysis. That said, we have quite a bit of socioeconomic information just on information from Cal EPA and the state identifying disadvantaged communities, which we can map out, and that really focuses on income levels. But in addition, Cal Adapt and other websites presents information on other categories of development, including high minority areas, you know, I have it right in front of me. Let me pull it up. Residents who might be affected that are over the age of 65, or under the age of 5, looking at different housing occupancies, renters versus owners, and female head of household with child. And really for that analysis, we'd be looking at comparing the overall impact area of the sea level rise impact area to the averages in the city. And then in addition, in 2015, the UCSB Bren School actually did a vulnerability assessment for the city that included a socioeconomic analysis. It did look at 5.5 feet of sea level rise instead of 6.6, but it has some really good information in there. And they take a look at a bunch of different factors that make different populations sensitive and map it out in the city. And so our initial thought is basically to do a simple analysis that includes all this existing information in order to do a more, and then put in an action for studying in the future in more detail socioeconomic impacts of different adaptation measures. So that's the plan with socioeconomic. I don't know if subcommittee members had any comments on that or wanted to discuss that.
On that in particular or on any of these?
I would say any of these items.
Madam Chair, I have a question. So does this include like the loss of recreational facilities that are available to the lower east and lower west side? Is it that kind of information? the loss of jobs in the area for my neighbors in the Lower West Side. Is that what we're talking about?
That would have to be part of a larger socioeconomic study. What I'm talking about is basically overlaying our impact area, our overall 6.6 feet of sea level rise impact area over these maps that show disadvantaged communities. I don't know if you can see, like they're just census blocks.
Yes.
And so identifying what kind of disadvantaged communities might be affected. But in this scope, I don't think that we would have the money to do a full analysis of job losses and things like that. Although I will tell you that the economic analysis did look at that,
Okay.
parts of that.
Yeah, that would be my concern, is that it is the accessible recreation areas for my neighborhood and the Lower East Side and things. So.
Okay.
Let's go in order. I'll go in order on my screen, and then to those whose cameras aren't on, just so that we make sure that everyone has a chance to ask a question or comment on this portion. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Ms. Hetrick, so I really see that social justice part as more that the plan, when it gets reviewed, will kind of have to pass muster on not a lot of plan going to protect wealthy property and whatever that really means at the cost of lower economic users and property, that it needs to be fair in that matter. Is that really where you see the starting comments heading out to?
So Councilmember Jordan, these edits I'm talking about are really just providing a baseline of like where are our disadvantaged communities so that we know moving forward. One of the comments I did want the subcommittee to discuss later is adding comments requesting that the subcommittee add into the guiding principles a principle that specifically calls out looking at socioeconomic benefits to disadvantaged groups as part of evaluating adaptation measures and prioritizing them.
Okay.
So we can talk about that. So this is really just the technical background that we're talking about
Right.
here. But yes, I think that was something that was requested in comments.
And then, you know, I really just kind of sat up, and the only comment letter that really got my attention was the Coastal Commission, of course. The talking still, you went over it really quick. Private property not on it, but is now the appropriate time to ask about the let me just ask the question. So I read most of the Coastal Commission stuff in regards to private property protection or bluff top protection as if it's our problem and not their problem or the state's problem, and no answer from them or help from them on the takings issue. Is this still a big festering problem that's out there in this process?
Councilmember Jordan, it's something that we've consistently brought up to the Coastal Commission, and they're very aware of our concerns for private property and also making sure that our regulations factor in private property rights and takings, and that if we have a regulation that could result in a taking of property, that we have a regulation addressing what to do in that case. That it still allows economic development of that parcel. So we have, as part of our LUP regulations, we do have new policies in there that address the situation where there could be a takings of property and what could be allowed, let's say on top properties that don't have enough room to move back or outside their required buffer areas. We still do allow development, but it's scaled back and it has to be as far back as possible and stuff like that. So yes, I think it's going to continue to be the perhaps #1 issue of associated with sea level rise.
Yeah, I guess so. My worry is, you know, from Planning Commission perspective too, even when we have a policy and we had to protect it in court, we lose, and nobody comes to our aid on that. And it just seems like the questions that Coastal Commission ask are continuing to put us on the defensive rather than on fair footing. So I guess that's a comment. That's the only two I have, Madam Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Jordan, do we have any questions at this point from Councilmember Friedman? Or we can come back to you also.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just have a few because I'm going to have to go out early. Apologize. I'm doing this remotely on a phone, but just overall, since we were talking about some of the things, I just wanted to kind of get where I'm in. I agree that we should, as a guiding principle, have something that references the social justice implications on it and economics. And then just some of the notes I have in general, I'll just be really quick, is that I like the idea of partnering with Beacon as a resource, not only for the regional settlement master plan update, but for monitoring and also using scientific experts, because we can look at it regionally and share the costs with other jurisdictions. And so I think that, and Beacon is also a resource to try to get state and federal dollars if we put in applications with them or have them do it, because the state is, from what I'm hearing through the League of Cities, and is that the state is going to be looking towards regional types of collaborations. So it would actually put us ahead to try to get the dollars that we're looking at. So just want to note that. And then for also wanted to just say that monitoring, again, coming from a couple of the comments that we received, monitoring is a key. So just to reiterate, what is the baseline we were at that we're monitoring from, but just that's where we need to really put some effort right now, because it'll tell how fast things are changing or how slowly they are. And then the last couple things, I just think overall, we should prioritize in the near term the harbor, such as raising the docks and also options for sterns, because reading it, the report, it seems that those are impacted at a lower level of sea rise, as low as like 0.5 feet. So those are kind of the areas I think. And then also starting to plan, or what is the process for the critical infrastructure that we need to deal with and put our resources towards those. So those are just my my general comments. And again, prioritizing funding sources from the state, advocating for those through means that we have in the currents of Beacon. So apologize if I jumped the gun here, but I might not be on for, I only have about 10 or 15 more minutes. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Chair Snedden, can I make a suggestion? Why don't I get through all the slides of the comments, and then let's
I
go through
apologize.
each. Yeah, it's okay. And then go through each committee member, because I feel like otherwise we might not get through just hearing what we're planning to address.
I apologize. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, next slide. The other two technical comments that came that ESA is going to address is clarifying the effectiveness of groins along the bluffs. I think there were several comments that were concerned that we were, in their own words, essentially giving up on keeping the beaches along the bluffs. Because if you remember, the document does make the finding that beach nourishment along the bluffs would not be effective at keeping beach sand along the bluffs. But in addition, that it wouldn't be very effective to put groins along the bluffs. And ESA, and further conversations with them and also with some other technical experts, it's not that we can't put a groin along the bluffs. That is not a common thing to do, because it's harder to build up sand in an area where you have the water hitting the bluffs and essentially creating a bathtub-like effect at every high tide. So when you see groins, you usually see them in an area that has a low-lying backstop. So for instance, in the waterfront area, we have our breakwater and groins, and there's a larger area for sand to build up on those beaches. And so if you wanted, ESA just wanted to clarify, if you wanted to try to build up sand in one little particular part of the bluff, you could put a groin, and they're not sure how effective it would be. And in addition, when you place a groin, it does affect the buildup of sand behind the groin on the other side of the groin. So then you basically have created a problem on the adjacent bluff side. The other thing that they wanted to clarify further in the document is that putting groins in along the bluffs would not help with bluff erosion, because essentially you'd still have waves hitting the base of the bluffs. It wouldn't keep that from happening. So it doesn't really help private property owners who are concerned about bluff erosion. It would be more just to try to keep sand on the beaches. But we could consider things like placing a groin at Arroyo Burro Beach or selective points. So that is the clarification with regard to that topic. Does anybody have specific questions to that clarification? Okay. And then I think I've mentioned there's in the comments that we received, ESA is going to be adding into the needed study list that is in the document, that we need to look at the impacts of rising groundwater levels spreading contamination. In our low-lying areas in particular, we have a lot of contaminated fill that was placed there after the 1929 earthquake. And so one of the issues that needs to be studied further is how rising groundwater levels might change the spread of contamination in that area. As we mentioned, socio and economic impacts. And then another study area that was identified through comments, particularly with the Creeks Committee, was potential changes we might want to make to creek setbacks and bridge design requirements, especially when we get more information about how river flows might change with climate impacts. So next slide. This is a comment that came out of the Planning Commission, and I did just want Commissioner Wiscombe is the one that sent me this for discussion about whether or not we need to change the document with regard to the monitoring plan. Commissioner Wiscombe, do you want to just speak to this comment for a minute?
Sure. It just seemed to be a theme at the Planning Commission that we need a transparent monitoring plan. And I'm going to go back to the technical comments where you talk about establishing a baseline. That was one of the things. I think that we need to make sure that the public has a place where they can follow sea level rise. So we do need the baseline. We need the frequency of the monitoring and by whom, and make sure that the public is educated on where this data is available. And then I just added, and I'm not sure this was a comment at the Planning Commission, but in reading the executive summary, I think it's important that that information be added to the executive summary, because this is really the starting point of our analysis of sea level rise impacts on our community. So that's.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. So as far as what we have at the document now, the document outlines that we need a shoreline monitoring program and looks at potential parameters that we can measure in the future. It does not decide on any parameters or discuss frequency by who or baseline information. So basically what the document does now is, as one of the near-term measures that should happen first, is the development of a shoreline monitoring plan that would have all these components. And initially we did try to include all this detail into this work effort, but it became very clear when we were developing that information that it was a big work effort, that it was beyond the scope of our available funds now. So that's why we are actually applying for grants right now to develop all these details. And so at this point, we could add in information about what we think that the shoreline monitoring program should have in the future. So basically these categories, but we won't have the resources now to define each of the baseline now or by whom now. Does that make sense? I know.
It seems to me that this is the basis for any action that we take in the future. We have all these prioritized actions that are triggered by sea level rise at certain points, and it seems to me that this is the starting point for our actual monitoring of sea level rise to see where we are in these various years that we're looking toward versus what is predicted in what we've chosen to predict in the plan, or predict is probably not the right word to use, but what the scientific evidence is showing in the modeling might happen in the years to 2100. So I don't know. I feel like this needs to be there for public confidence that this is gonna be a working document moving forward. So we have to start somewhere. That's my feeling, if that makes any sense.
And I see Commissioner Sloan also has a comment, and Vice Chair Davis as well.
So at one point, didn't we talk about the state providing us with this data? Having them have the responsibility of giving us the data on sea level rise? I thought that was a discussion we had early on. Did I remember that incorrectly?
Yeah, Commissioner Sloan. So it depends on what data we're talking about. So,
Yeah, sea level rise, right.
my hope in general is that eventually all the jurisdictions up and down the state are monitoring the same things and using the same parameters. In speaking to the state, there is not a movement right now to define what everybody should be monitoring. It's assumed that we are all going to start it separately. And so part of what we've been working with Beacon is developing a pilot program that can be scaled up to both the region and the state. Like, hey, we need to start monitoring now. So we'll come up with this now, and with the hopes that it can be scaled up. And definitely for the region, but at the state level too. Much of the data, though, that really a lot of what we're talking about in the monitoring plan is not us collecting new data. It's essentially taking data that's already out there and making sense of it. So for instance, we'd be looking at NOAA buoys or USGS groundwater levels and making sense of the data for our purposes, right? So there's only a few categories where we would actually need to look at new data collection, and those are certain beach width areas. Beacon does do beach widths now, but not that many in the city. And then tracking bluff erosion over time. So there is the other thing with the baseline is a lot of it depends on the data that we're talking about, what kind of baseline is available, if that makes sense, and what the different triggers are. So I do think we can have ESA elaborate more, especially moving into the executive summary, more information on what they are seeing as the likely parameters of the program and what the baseline would be and who could provide those. A lot of that general information is in the plan. A lot of what the city needs to do in looking at a shoreline monitoring plan with Beacon is looking at, we don't want to commit ourselves to monitoring that we can't keep funding year after year, or which is going to require a ton of effort that that we can't keep going. And so some of the categories recommended in the plan would be nice data to have, but there are questions about if we would want to continue funding it. So there are a lot of details to figure out with a monitoring plan, but I think we could do our best to put into the executive summary at least what are the definite things that we need to monitor. There's things, of course, we need to monitor. So sea levels and groundwater levels and things like that. But there are other categories that need to still be worked out. And part of that is figuring out who has capacity for what. So can Beacon take it on? They have an interest in that. But
We're
Thank
gonna-
you. Vice Chair Davis?
Yeah, my comment was simply going to be, and again, just picking up on what Melissa just said and everybody else has said, everybody agrees to the outline here as providing details on a transparent monitoring program, right? And everybody's going to agree that it should be done regionally or on a statewide basis, so we're all using the same baselines. Everybody agrees on that, and everybody's going to have to do an adaptation plan in the next few years. Right. What I'm looking at is the fact that, working through Beacon or other regional cooperation things in the next 5 years, let's set up what that needs to be. So perhaps all we're really talking about, trying to get this into executive summary and into this document, we're really talking about is an action within the 5-year implementation plan to come together to format what the basis is going to be going forward for the next 50 or 60 years. And the capacities and all those things, who does it and what should be in there, should be really worked out by the people who are going to be doing the monitoring. So my suggestion would be, yes, we agree on providing a transparent monitoring program, and that needs to be technically developed as part of the implementation plan going forward.
Thank you for that. And Commissioner Sloan, were you finished? I saw that you maybe had something to say on that, or did that
No,
close out for you?
I think that did it. I think it's important that we have the state or somebody tell us what the sea level rise is, rather than us and Beacon doing it for here and then someone else doing it for San Francisco or Monterey, and then you're going to get into all kinds of legal challenges and all of that. But I think what Dave said was a good one. We put this in the plan that we're going to figure that out, and it has to be someone like the state or the federal government, some unimpeachable source that gives us that data, and it's not just us all figuring it out ourselves. And as Melissa said, there's cost, and how are we going to continue a local monitoring program going forward? We need someone else to provide us that data that we're going off of for a long term. So that was my only other comment.
Agreed. Thank you. Are there any other on this particular item? Any other comments or questions? Okay. Thank you, Ms. Hutchett.
great, yeah, those are great comments. Okay, so next slide. So now this next category of comments are things that I do think the subcommittee needs to have a broader conversation about. So I'm going to just go through them fast in a list fashion to make sure I have the list of items that we need to discuss. And then at the end, if there's anything that you guys want to add to the list for discussion, but we won't be discussing each of the items just yet. So the list that came up for subcommittee discussion were various requests for modifications to the guiding principles, and those included adding a principle advocating for minimization of impacts to disadvantaged groups, or another variation of that is considering socioeconomic impacts and costs and benefits as we're moving forward. Prioritizing, not just encouraging projects with co-benefits, particularly those that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I believe the guiding principles now use the word encourage for projects with co-benefits, but there was comments requesting that they just not be encouraged, but actually prioritized. That we encourage ecosystem-based adaptation. Next slide. That we add a principle that explicitly prioritizes the harbor and other very critical assets, things like the wastewater system, and roads. That we add into our guiding principles minimization of impacts, not just to existing development, which is a guiding principle now, but also to future development. And that we add a principle that emergency response, or two principles, that emergency response and recovery coordination and greenhouse gas reductions are key aspects of sea level rise planning. Next slide. And then also that we add a principle to incentivize voluntary resilience measures. So things like permit streamlining, or considering that as we're moving along as a key component to our adaptation planning. Next slide. So for the near-term actions, there was a number of comments requesting certain considerations. One was to change language where we wrote consider changes to floodplain regulations south of Highway 101, to change that to not consider it, but to actually do it. So being more certain that we want to do that. That we add a near-term actions to identify incentives for raising or otherwise modifying structures in development to be more resilient voluntarily, so that we research things such as permit streamlining and other incentives in the near term. Next slide. And then this was a comment that I actually got quite frequently verbally in commission meetings, that the near-term action list, while divided up into high priority and for the next 5 years and normal priority, was still overwhelming, and that it would be really good to have a few key actions highlighted as, hey, these are the things that we need to aggressively seek funding and do right away. And I did preliminarily talk to ESA. What do you feel are the items if you had to make that list? And they mentioned the harbor breakwater, the Laguna Tide Gate, the movement of wastewater infrastructure from under the beach, updates to the hazard mitigation plan. And the reason for that is the avenue from which we can get federal funding for all of our projects. And then in addition, they did just email me this morning that they would also add in studying the potential for additional beach nourishment and where that sand could come from, and if we have more capacity with dredging and things like that. So we can discuss that. Next slide. And then several comments that the subcommittee could discuss. There were several comments about whether or not to reevaluate the overall adaptation plan more frequently. Right now, the recommendation in the plan is at least every 10 years, or as significant new information comes. Some comments ask for more like 5 years. And then in general, we thought it would be good to discuss the role of the subcommittee moving forward. Next slide. So that is the list that I would like to go through based on the comments I've already received from you, but I would like to go around and hear if there are additional topics that the subcommittee would like to discuss.
May I, just for procedurally here, we looking to settle each of these today, or will we come up with a framework for our next few meetings where we'll tackle these individually? Or was your hope that we would move through and get this completed today, addressing these subcommittee comments?
So Chair Sneddon, it depends on what other comments the subcommittee members have. If we don't have that many, I would like to start going through that list and seeing how far we can get. I don't think we'll get all the way through it, and then we'll go through the rest of them at our next meeting.
Okay, thank you. So then for this particular round, it's just if you have anything in addition, so not comments yet on these bullet points, but just if there are additional comments that we want to address.
Yes,
Okay.
if there's anything not on the list for subcommittee discussion that you want to make sure that the subcommittee discusses in the next few meetings.
Thank you. And then why don't we go in order of on the agenda so people know when they might be called on. In order of the agenda, the names is listed under commission members. So we could, just as a round here, if there are additional comments, we could start then with Vice Chair Davis and then work our way through and end with Commissioner Wiscombe, if that sounds. Okay, so Vice Chair Davis.
Okay, the only item that I would say wasn't there, which I'd like to see some discussion on, is the discussion of large-scale shoreline protection devices. You know, armoring the beach, raising streets, railroads, and other public assets. That issue. That's the only issue which I did not see on the list. Otherwise, I'm good with what you got there and have comments when we get there.
Thank you. And is Councilmember Friedman still on the line, or we lost him, I think? But he made his comments, I think, on that. And then Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Melissa, I'm still just, I just have this level of concern on the whole private property rights. Do you maintain those private property rights? Is there legislation somewhere else or locally that begins to appropriately erode those private property rights? I just know it's a festering thing, and I'm unsure if this is where to ask for more discussion on that, but that's the only thing that concerns me that wasn't on that list.
Councilmember Jordan, I'll just respond to that. Before you were on the subcommittee, we did have a subcommittee meeting where we talked about that. I will tell you that there's not a lot of answers right now with regard to sea level rise and how that might play out in the courts. So we can certainly review some of that. I will tell you also that the Santa Barbara County Climate Collaborative was actually just in the process of setting up a webinar for our collaborative agencies with Georgetown Law School on private property rights and how it relates to sea level rise planning, that it might be a good webinar for the subcommittee to attend if there's availability, because that would be much more in depth than anything I could provide.
Yep.
Okay.
That's kind of in my
my
wonky comfort zone. Was the prior discussion on, is it available on tape? Was it televised?
It wasn't. It was a subcommittee meeting quite a bit ago. I can send you the presentation.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'll catch up and then quit asking questions you've already talked about, maybe then.
It's one of those topics where you could talk about it on and on.
All questions are good questions, and that is a topic that came up in public comment and at different commissions as well. So it's an important one to come back to. Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, my only comment is centered around a conversation we had at one of the subcommittee meetings is identifying state and federal grants and funding and how we're going to address that. Is that going to be done centrally through the city, or is each department going to be going after their own funds? As will the harbor department go after funds for the breakwater, or how are we going to address some of the big ticket items that we're going to have? Because I think in one of our discussions when we first saw that the cost of all of this, we all kind of looked at it and goes, there's no way we can pay for this ourselves. And so how are we going to identify where those funds are available and how we're going to go after them? So that would be my comment.
Thank you. And Commissioner Kramer? If you're there, I saw you earlier. You can always come back.
I would second what Jim Sloan just said about the sources of funding. Other than that, I think it's been covered well.
Thank you. Commissioner Longstreet?
I am happy with what you have so far. I just see this as such a work in progress that we have everything we identifies something else. So it's a living document that we have to be prepared to to use and adapt with. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Chair Snedden. Both my comments, really, and what precedes them are questions, were addressed primarily by Council Member Friedman and a Subcommittee Vice Chair Davis. So I think for now I'm good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And Commissioner Wiscombe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with the comments and with the additional things that have been added. I think they're good topics, and I have nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll also agree that I think we have the main topics covered here. And then as we go through the bullet points, so important, the prioritization. I agree that it's still an overwhelming, and we have all these individual tables of costs and priorities within a subset, but we still don't have the overarching, these are the next 5 things that have to happen immediately while we're working on these long-term items. And I think there's so much detail in this document, but we still don't have it distilled down. So I think that's what I'll be looking for. And then also the funding. I think if we have too many priorities, too much scale that it's insurmountable and too expensive, we just won't be able to get that line item in the budget so that we are planning for this. This has to be as big of an item carrying forward that we know is coming, we budget for, we don't cut from it, and we can't get that if we have too big of a work project in line. So we'll carry on and go through the bullet points then. Thank you.
Chair Snedden? Oh, you cut out.
Oh, did I?
Oh, maybe it was
All
just
of
for
that?
me.
Was it
No,
all of
just
it?
the very end. I think
It's
you were.
not important. We can move on to the bullet points there.
I can hear. Maybe it
Oh,
just
Take it on.
was. I
okay,
think
maybe it was.
I can hear. So
Okay,
Okay.
I think I got the
Pass the
gist of it.
baton. Okay, thank you.
So I just want to do a time check before we move on. It's 11:07. Do we want to go through some of the guiding principle items and then go to public comment?
Yes, I think we have it because we have another subset there, and then stopping for public comment. And then we really do need to set our goals for our next few meetings on how to address those as well. So you have a better idea of timing for the next section. Do you think that's a good block, and then have the public comment?
Why don't, actually, it might be a good idea to go to public comment now.
Okay.
If there's
That
anything
seems-
that needs, yeah, and then we're done with that, and we can see how far we go with everything else.
That sounds great. I think that's a good idea. How many public commenters do we have?
So if anybody would like to, oh, go ahead.
All right, so if anybody would like to make a public comment, the instructions are on the screen here. So it's a little counterintuitive. You need to click the raise your hand icon, but red means raised, and if it's green, it means it's down. Right now, we currently have 1 person with their hands raised. That's Miss Hillary Hauser. So you'll have 2 minutes to speak. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you here, and then you'll have to unmute yourself. And once you start talking, I will make the timer go.
Thank you. Hillary Hauser, Heal the Ocean, and I don't even need 2 minutes to thank all of you for your work on this document, and Allison Thompson in the Heal the Ocean office and I have gone through this and raised some questions, and just generally speaking, we are pleased with the way it's going. Yes, we have concerns about the definitive markers for sea level rise that we think could be changing. They're not static. So I think you talked about that, and we really like the suggestion that it be reviewed every 5 years instead of 10. And want to thank you all for all your work.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other public comment?
Chair Sneddon, right now I don't see anyone else with their hands raised. Might just give it another second or two, just because it's the digital format and all. And right now I still don't see anyone, so might hand it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. And then if anybody else should come thinking that the public comment was going to be at the end, I think we should allow just a few minutes at the end there if anybody else joins. Okay, Ms. Hetrick, back to you.
Wow, I was muted.
Oh, sorry.
I
I'm
said,
also thinking that Councilmember Jordan may need to leave early as well. So Councilmember Jordan, if at any time before you leave, if you have some final comments, just jump right in there and get them in before you go.
So Mr. Bolton, if you wouldn't mind going to slide number 17. Okay, so let's just take what's on this slide now. So with regard to the guiding principles, if you all want to give an indication of the types of things you would like to add in these lists, our staff can work on writing up the exact language and you guys could review it at your next subcommittee meeting. So we don't need to wordsmith per se right now, but I would like to get an idea from the subcommittee about whether or not these modifications to the guiding principles would be something that the subcommittee is interested in. So on this slide, we have advocating or adding a principle advocating for minimization of impacts to disadvantaged groups. We already have a guiding principle. It's in our executive summary that does speak to, so right now the guiding principles state that we should encourage adaptation actions that broadly benefit the community and provide equitable sharing of costs and benefits of sea level rise and related hazards. The comments that I received was that they really wanted to see something very specifically about disadvantaged groups and making sure that we are not negatively affecting. So does the subcommittee have any comments on adding a principle with regard to that?
And how about if there's disagreement or modification to it? I think in general, we have agreement with many of these. So if there's additional information or discomfort or disagreement with it, then we'll just have you speak up if there's anyone who'd like to comment on this one.
Okay. The next one is right now, there's a guiding principle that encourages adaptation strategies that have co-benefits, such as greenhouse gas reduction, resiliency to other climate change impacts, habitat protection or creation of new recreation opportunities, improvements to coastal resources, or economic enhancement. And the requests were to essentially move that from encourage to guiding principle number 1 that prioritizes action. So right now, in our guiding principles, what's prioritized are protection of human life, health, and safety, and protection of critical facilities, public transportation systems, and public services for basic city functions. So this change would essentially, instead of encouraging adaptation strategies with co-benefits, put them in that prioritization column.
I will say that I'm not as fond of this reprioritization. I think when you put this on par with protecting life and health and safety, it doesn't rise to the same priority for me. I'm comfortable with it staying as encouraging. I don't know if there are other comments from commissioners. Vice Chair Davis?
I agree.
Commissioner Wiscombe?
Yes, I also agree. Hearing your argument to leave it where it is, I think it doesn't meet the level of health, safety, and welfare of our community. So I think it should stay where it is.
Any other comment on that? Okay.
Okay. There was a request to add in the encouraging section of the guiding principles, encouraging ecosystem-based adaptation. So
Any
that would
comment,
be,
Vice Chair Davis?
I would support doing that.
Same.
Isn't that already covered in the box of possible actions? I mean, it's something that needs to be separated, and then how do you define ecosystem-based issues? I mean, that could be different things to different people. So do we, if we do put that in there, how to clarify a little bit?
I think with the Commissioner Sloan, I think the intent of the comment was that we try to use nature-based and habitat-based measures as much as we can instead of hard protection measures. We do have guiding principles now that encourage avoidance and minimization of impacts to coastal resources and habitat protection, and that encourage adaptation strategies that have co-benefits of habitat protection. I think this comment was wanting to encourage it more, like make it something that we see, that we evaluate everything through that lens.
Well, I think we need to define it as such. I mean, just ecosystem has a broad range of definitions. And so I think I understand what the intent is, but I'm not sure just stating it like that could be read that way.
And Chair Sneddon, you're not seeing my hand because you're taking notes, I gather. But
I'm sorry.
no, that's all right. I agree with Jim. I think that we do have 5C adaptation strategies with co-benefits, and one of them is habitat protection or creation. And I think this is maybe speaking to ecosystem-based adaptation. I think it's speaking to possibly creation more, but I think it's already there. And I also like our kind of one-page summary of our guiding principles. So I think if we keep adding specific things to them, it just gets to be too long. But I think it's covered. I don't know, Melissa, do you think it's covered?
Commissioner Wiscombe, I think consideration for habitat impacts and wanting to see stuff, encouraging things that also have benefits to habitats is in there. I think if you wanted to be more explicit about having a priority of wanting to do nature-based stuff over other stuff, that is not particularly in there or very straightforward in there right now.
I would add that I'm not sure it should be the priority. I mean, if something can, a tide gate that's manufactured and is not ecosystem based, and it might be, it takes care of the problem without causing damage, without harming habitats, then I'm not sure we then need to prioritize, well, could we do that with a dune and a planting system instead? I'm not sure we want to make that a decision-making factor in that way. Vice Chair Davis.
I basically supported it because it wasn't a priority. It didn't say make it a priority. It simply said encourage, which I thought was putting in the decision-making process when we're looking at something. Are there eco-based alternatives to look at those things and weigh them against the other solutions. So I saw it as just recognizing that where possible, you basically look at the eco-based adaptation strategy in your decision-making process. That's why it was just an encourage.
Could it be added to 5C so that it doesn't go over to the next page?
That's what I thought it could be also. Yeah, and somehow wrap it into the 5C, which goes back to Leslie's comment, which would be yeah, I support that.
I would support that as well, as an addition to 5C. Okay, we've got a thumbs up from Mr. Sloan as well. No dissent. Okay, we'll carry on.
Okay, the next one was adding a principle that explicitly prioritizes the harbor as a critical facility and/or explicitly prioritizing other critical facilities as well. So like actually listing them as opposed to, so right now, if you go to the guiding principles, thank you, Mr. Bolton, for pulling that up. The first one prioritizes critical facilities in general. So critical facilities, public transportation systems, public services for basic city functions. So the idea of this is making sure that it's known that the harbor is one of these, but also potentially identifying things like El Estero, like what the subcommittee sees as the most important facilities.
Ms. Hedrick, could I ask, I think we don't have Councilmember Friedman. I think we possibly have lost Councilmember Jordan, and Commissioner Wiscombe, I believe, will need to be leaving the meeting as well. And we're moving into what could be a bigger discussion of what those priorities might be listed in there. Might this be a good place to talk about our next committee meetings and our plan, or do you want to move through that one? Or Commissioner Wiscombe, what is your timing?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm going to have to go. If you want me to make a comment on this one, I think critical facilities covers it, and public services for basic city functions covers it. But that's just my comment. I think, and maybe that's just being on this subcommittee, we've all talked about what those are, and that includes the harbor. So that would be my comment, unless under 1B, we want to actually spell out some of the critical facilities that, but I am going to have to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Yes.
I would have trouble listing things that are important to us today that that may change over time for one reason or another, that acts like we really think something's more important. I think I like this broad base of what we need to do, what we need to watch, and then be watchful of that. Not, because the harbor's important to one person and Stearns Wharf to another, what happens when it becomes Cliff Drive or, shoreline access, or so I think we need to just leave it as broad-based as it is, so that all things are considered at the time it needs to be considered. Thank you.
Vice Chair Davis.
I agree with that. I think I went into the discussion thinking adding a few things might be helpful, but I think BB's overview there really nailed it for me. I think leave it as it is.
I have the same impression. I wanted to add harbor in there, and then hearing that it does change that. Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Coming from the Harbor Commission, I would love to see that the top priority, but I think there are other priorities that could be, that are also very important. So I think leaving that, and if we wanted to identify them, maybe identify them in the body of the document rather than the guiding principles. But I'd also like to say that would second your suggestion that we move on to talking about what the next meeting is, and maybe tabling this discussion until that meeting.
Thank you. I think that sounds about right.
Okay, so as far as upcoming meetings, so we have enough information now to basically get ESA going on any technical edits they do, any kind of edits we make to guiding principles and the priority of near-term actions and wordsmithing near-term actions we can do at a later date. I really just wanted to get ESA moving on any big chunks of changes. And so our next scheduled meeting is November 11th. And so as far as that meeting, I think we'd finished going through this list. And in addition to the items that were added to it by other subcommittee members. And then if there's time after that, I think we would want to talk about what potentially could be included in a subcommittee recommendation, but not actually take a vote on the recommendation itself yet. So that staff could put together a draft for the next meeting where you would then consider the final document. So ESA would provide edits and we'd have the final document, and then you could consider a recommendation that would be a draft written up by staff. Does that sound like a good plan for moving forward?
Just a quick note that November 11th is Veterans Day, and we may have some conflicts with that. We may want to poll committee members and make sure I'm able to make that meeting, but I don't know if that's, we want everybody here for these final meetings. I think it's really important that we have everyone.
I can, Chair Sneddon, I can send out an email making sure that people can attend that meeting.
Okay. And then if not, then consider rescheduling. Yes, Commissioner Schwartz.
I would also suggest we consider as to whether or not to hold a meeting that day, because we like to welcome public comment, since that is a holiday important to many. I don't know if that's sensitive to members of the public who otherwise have plans, important commitments, family events, if it's appropriate to hold a meeting on that day. So just for your consideration.
I agree. I think maybe we should just make the call now not to have a meeting on Veterans Day, and if we could look at rescheduling that meeting.
Okay, yeah, I will send out an email looking for additional meeting dates then.
Not to interrupt your flow of process of what we're covering at the next. So we're looking at 2 to 3 meetings. We're hoping to then have a consolidated recommendation for council, and then it's out of our hands. And then we'll also need to have a discussion, I think, when we have everybody, about the future role of the committee. If there is a future role, what that might be, if there is, and how we move forward from there. But we really do need everyone for that discussion. Do we have any public comment? Did any other members of the public join us?
Chair Sneddon, members of the public, if anyone wants to make a public comment, please raise your hand using the raise your hand icon. Red means raised. Right now, I still see one person with their hand raised, and that's Miss Hillary Hauser again. Not sure how you want to handle that. I do not see anyone else with their hands raised. Chair Sneddon.
Thank you. We could ask Ms. Hauser if she intended to have her hand raised or not. I'm going to guess not.
I meant to raise it. Wait. Yeah, I meant to raise it. And I realized that this is after the public comment period that was before. And so I can wait till the next meeting. But on number one, thank you for not having a meeting on Veterans Day. It is an important day for a lot of people. But number two, on the priorities, somehow within this process, I hope that we can get in the impact to the coastal zone of groundwater contamination, sea level rise and groundwater contamination. And knowing that there's not a lot of money out there for new studies and so forth, I really want to stress that there are existing studies that show where the Cuesta study in particular, 2003, was a countywide assessment of septic systems in high groundwater already. And so if that document can be pulled into this process, that would be great. I know this is way out of order, but I'm saying it now anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. You had a minute remaining from your last public comment, so I'm going to consolidate that into one. And thank you for that comment. We are talking about that, and I think that can go in with the other technical comments that we've raised as well.
Thank you, Councilor.
Yeah.
And I don't see anyone else with their hands raised, so I think we can close public comment again and hand it back to you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. And Ms. Hetrick, do you have what you need from us before adjourning, or is there any last item?
Chair Senate, I just would ask the subcommittee if there's any tips for how to improve the format of this meeting, given we have this new format now, to let me know. And if anything would help move the meeting along better, please pass that on to me.
Thank you so much. Nicely done. And we'll await the date of our next meeting. So we'll close without knowing, but we know that we're not meeting on November 11th. And thank you. We'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.